Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. President Volodyrmr Zelenskyy confirms Ukraine is preparing to sign a minerals deal with the United States. President Trump says he expects the deal to be signed this week. Meanwhile, Trump reveals his vision for Gaza in an AI video featuring him sunbathing on the beach with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His former Deputy National Security Advisor tells us why it's meant to be hopeful. And UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is accused of pandering to Trump as he boosts Britain's defence budget but slashes foreign aid ahead of their meeting at the White House tomorrow. Now, Ukrainian President Volodyrmr Zelenskyy has said Ukraine is preparing to sign an initial deal with the United States on investment in his country, but security guarantees are yet to be decided. He made the remarks during a press conference a few hours ago following the announcement that Ukraine has agreed the terms of a major minerals deal with the US. Let's hear what else he had to say.
Of course, this agreement is about economics, but I asked for there to be at least an understanding that we are seeing things the same way, that all of it is part of future security guarantees. So, even in the framework agreement, I wanted for there to be at least a sentence, security guarantees for Ukraine. As far as I was briefed by the government officials, the sentence is there now. I don't remember, probably in point 10 or in some other, but it is important that it is there. Regarding my visit to the US, we were offered a date. The teams are working. What format? When? There is a preliminary date which President Trump mentioned, Friday. The teams are working.
For more on this, I'm now joined by our correspondent, Stuart Smith, who's in Kyiv. Stuart, this is actually quite a turnaround compared to the war of words both Zelenskyy and Trump were exchanging last week. We don't know all the details yet, but it seems a positive step forward. And we know Trump is holding his first cabinet meeting right now and has confirmed that Zelenskyy will be in Washington on Friday.
Yeah, that seemed to be in doubt shortly after President Zelenskyy gave his press conference earlier when one White House official interpreted what he said as implying that the deal could still be changed ahead of him flying to Washington, which would have meant that effectively the trip was off, with him not wanting to turn up to DC in order to negotiate further, officials wanting all the issues ironed out with this agreement sooner than him turning up in Washington. But there's a caveat to all of this, which is while there was a lot of disagreement over the past few weeks about the minerals deal and what would and would not be included, largely the way that has been resolved is by pushing the difficult issues to be discussed later, to be included in a separate deal, which would require a lot more discussion between the United States and Ukraine. So, for example, as the president said there, and indeed as he thought in Article 10, there is a reference to security guarantees, but that's all it is. It's a reference. It says the US supports Ukraine's efforts to obtain security guarantees needed to establish lasting peace. And that's it, because what President Zelenskyy says as part of this deal is that the whats and the hows and the wherefores will be decided later, such as which security guarantees Washington could provide and also how much money Ukraine is expected to put up here.
As you said, the what's and how's still to be decided. But Stuart, what will Ukraine actually get from this deal?
Well, what we do know from the text, which has been published and it's all fully laid out online if you want to look into it, and effectively says there's going to be a fund set up, a fund that Ukraine will deposit revenue into that comes from oil, gas extraction, from mining, and also from other activities related to that. A fund which will be managed 50-50 with the United States, and then the profits of that fund will be reinvested and then used to help rebuild Ukraine after any ceasefire deal. It only applies to new development, the thinking here being that by forcing only new development funds to be part of this agreement, then it will force American investors, if they would like to make some money, to come to Ukraine to start operations, and therefore Washington will be required to support them, presumably through security guarantees. So in this agreement, President Zelenskyy says he's achieved what he wanted in terms of a framework. He's got references to security guarantees. He's removed that $500 billion figure that Donald Trump initially suggested and the initial draft said would be relevant. And he's removed that 100% interest rate, which would have come on that $500 billion, effectively forcing Ukraine to pay $1 trillion for what Volodymyr Zelenskyy says was a no-strings-attached grant, and regardless was more like $100 billion in aid.
Stuart Smith in Kyiv, thank you so much for joining me. Now we can go to Washington to speak to Victoria Coates, Vice President for National Security at the Heritage Foundation and former Deputy National Security Advisor for the Trump administration. Victoria, a pleasure to have you on the show. As I mentioned, Trump's holding his first cabinet meeting right now. I'm sure he'll cover a whole lot of issues. Earlier today, Zelenskyy said Ukraine is preparing to sign the US investment deal, but this is only the very first step. You worked very closely with Donald Trump. What can we expect in the coming days?
Well, it's good to be with you, and thank you for having me. This, I think, is the beginning of what will be an extended process, as President Trump has said, to end the Ukraine war. But I'd point out that what we're going to see, both with President Macron's visit earlier this week, with Prime Minister Starmer's visit tomorrow, and then President Zelensky's visit on Friday, is the first diplomatic movement on Ukraine that we've seen in 3 years of war. We marked the third anniversary of the invasion on Monday. So I would see this as a very hopeful first step. I think it is a good model to build on in terms of a both economic and security agreement between the United States and other countries that need assistance, but not necessarily charity, if you see what I mean. So this is, I think, a very, very positive step for both the United States and Ukraine, and I hope the rest of Europe takes notice.
Victoria, as I actually touched on a little bit earlier with our correspondent in Kyiv, does the rare earths deal with the US actually guarantee Ukraine help, something that the rest of Europe can sort of work around?
In terms of a security guarantee?
Yes, in terms of a security guarantee.
Well, that's going to be the big question here, because, of course, there were security guarantees in the Bucharest memorandum in 1994 when Ukraine agreed to denuclearize, and those guarantees were not upheld by either Russia, the United States, or the UK when Russia seized Crimea and then invaded 3 years ago. So putting a security guarantee on paper is something I'm fairly skeptical of. But what I see in this agreement is a vested United States interest in the prosperity and stability of Ukraine. If we've got investments and we have money on the line and money to be made, then that is a much more material commitment on the part of the United States than anything you could write in an agreement.
Why have rare earth minerals become a significant focus for Donald Trump, particularly concerning Ukraine and Greenland?
Well, in both Ukraine and Greenland, you have a disproportionate quantity of the Earth's resources in these areas. And we have some of them here in the United States, and certainly not as much as are in Greenland and Ukraine. And these are the building blocks for a lot of the advanced technologies in which the United States excels. And so we are going to need increased access to these resources. And the nice thing about the United States is we're willing to pay for them. And my understanding, and I haven't seen the final text of the agreement, is this allows us to be the purchaser of first refusal. So we're not saying we're taking them. We're saying we would like to be able to buy them from you. And as I said, I think this is an important model for how we might approach similar relationships, particularly in Africa and Latin America, where you have developing countries that need assistance from the United States, need to develop their resources. That's something we can do collaboratively with them to our mutual benefit.
Victoria, a little bit of switching gears here. Today, Trump also posted an AI video showing his vision for Gaza, featuring the president sunbathing alongside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's faced a lot of criticism, but what's your take on this video?
Well, this is certainly not the first AI-generated video that the president has posted, and this one also featured much more prominently Elon Musk, who is also present in this vision of Gaza. And rather than, focus on the criticism, I would focus on the vision for Gaza. I mean, this is a beautiful Gaza, which it should be. It's an extraordinary piece of real estate, which is how the president approaches it. And it can be rebuilt to be a wonderful place for Israelis and Palestinians. And, the vast majority of the people in the video are AI renderings of Palestinians. So I think this is President Trump saying, hey, this is what could be. This is what maybe should be if we can get past the immediate problems here. So I think he is the first person to have put any ideas on the table for Gaza. We now have a meeting of the Arab League next March 4th, I guess, coming up next week. So they are talking about a counter plan. Of course, the president would be willing to negotiate, but up until he made his remarks on Gaza, nobody had any ideas about what would happen the day after. And at least he's got a positive vision and a hopeful one.
Victoria Coates, Vice President for National Security at the Heritage Foundation and former Deputy National Security Advisor for the Trump administration. Thank you so much for joining me on the show this evening.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. President Trump has announced plans to sell a gold card to wealthy foreign investors who want permanent U.S. citizenship. The visa program would cost $5 million and will give investors the privileges of a green card. Speaking to reporters, Trump says the new scheme would replace the EB-5 program, and further details about the gold card scheme would be released in 2 weeks' time. British Airways has been named the worst long-haul carrier by the UK consumer watchdog Which. Customers of the British Airlines say it has failed to keep up with market competitors. That's despite the airline making billions of dollars of investments into improving its services. Meanwhile, Ryanair has been ranked at the bottom of the list as the worst short-haul carrier. Now, an Australian couple have criticised Qatar Airways after claiming they were forced to sit next to a dead body on a long-haul flight. They say the traumatic incident took place whilst they were on a 14-hour trip from Melbourne to Doha, and a woman died in the aisle beside them. Mitchell Ring and Jennifer Collin say cabin crew draped a blanket over her body and placed it next to the couple without offering them a chance to move seats. The airline issued an apology and said it was in the process of contacting passengers on the flight. And South Korea's fertility rate has increased in 2024 for the first time in 9 years. Data shows it's after a rise in marriages and various initiatives to encourage young people to settle down and have children. In the Asian country, there is a high correlation between marriages and births, and in 2024, South Korea marked a major jump in marriages, up 14.9%, the biggest since 1970. Let's go to Israel now, where the funeral of hostage Shiri Bibas and her 2 children, Ariel and Kafir, has taken place today. Thousands of Israelis lined the streets to pay their respects to the 3 family members abducted from kibbutz near Oz on October the 7th. The remains of Shiri Bibas were finally returned to her family last Friday after Hamas admitted they returned an unidentified body the day before. Before her return, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed that Hamas would pay the full price for what he called a violation of the ceasefire deal. We can now speak to a former advisor to Netanyahu, Daniel Rubenstein. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. During Shiri Bibas's funeral, her sister-in-law called on all Israeli officials to take responsibility for the deaths, saying her loved ones could have been saved. What do you make of that statement, and could Israel have done more?
The October 7th massacre was a horribly depressing and awful day in Israel that saw 1,200 Israelis massacred and 251 taken hostage into Gaza. We still are awaiting answers. We, the Israeli public, are awaiting answers about how such an event could happen, given our preparations and our understanding of what we are dealing with from our neighbors. These questions will be answered in an official state commission of inquiry one day. But today was a day for mourning the loss of Shiri Bibas and her 2 young boys who were taken from their home by Hamas terrorists, taken into Gaza, murdered, and then their bodies were held for a ransom payment that we only were able to pay recently and finally receive the bodies so that they could have a proper funeral in Israel. It's a very sad time. And I'm just thinking, this is not the Islam that I know. Islam calls for the treatment of captives in a fair and humane manner, not the humiliation, not the parades that the Hamas government of Gaza puts on. What we're seeing is a disgrace to Islam, and I'm hoping that all leaders of the Muslim world will speak out against what the Hamas government has done by starting a war, taking hostages, holding them in horrific conditions, chaining them, using them as slaves, and demanding a ransom for their return.
We mentioned Netanyahu's anger regarding the mix-up of her remains before they were eventually returned to the family. What's been his reaction to today's funeral, and does he still believe Hamas should pay the price?
I have not seen the Prime Minister give a specific reaction to the funeral today, but of course, the Prime Minister believes, the opposition leader believes, the people of Israel believe that Hamas must not only pay a price for the treatment of these hostages, but Hamas must pay a price for the October 7th massacre, which saw the invasion of 3,000 men and the massacre of people in their homes and the gunning down of hundreds of people at a music festival. The response to this atrocity, this crime against humanity, is that Hamas cannot be the government of Gaza anymore. It was the Hamas government of Gaza that ordered the October 7th massacre, and Gaza cannot have a future of peace if it has a government that is declaring that Israel must be destroyed and that it will carry out more October 7th massacres until Israel is destroyed. This is the Hamas policy, and it is for this reason that Hamas must be removed from power, and I hope the whole international community will speak with one voice on this very simple need.
The first phase of the ceasefire is due to expire on Saturday. Hamas have confirmed they will return the bodies of 4 dead Israeli hostages tonight. When can we expect the second stage of the agreement, and what does a second stage actually look like?
The timeline for the second stage remains unclear, and it must be negotiated if it's going to happen. What stage 2 called for in the original ransom agreement that Israel agreed to pay to Hamas was that Israel would withdraw 100% from the Gaza Strip in exchange for the return of every hostage. In exchange for the return of every hostage. Now, the problem with this is that if Israel withdraws completely from Gaza, then Hamas remains the government of Gaza, and Hamas government of Gaza is saying that they should carry out more massacres like they did on October 7th. So what Israel is looking for in the diplomatic arena now is an understanding from all of the entire international community that Hamas cannot be the government of Gaza. And if Hamas is going to be the government of Gaza, there's not going to be a phase 2 where Israel withdraws completely and allows Gaza to be reconstructed with Hamas still in power, with Hamas still taxing commerce in Gaza and using this money to train and equip and fund its terrorist army.
There are reports that the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff postponed his trip to Israel today as this deadline looms for the extension of phase 1. What message does that send, and will it affect the next stage of negotiations?
It remains very unclear what is going to happen in the next phase of negotiations because of what I just said. Israel's demand is that Hamas cannot be the government of Gaza. Hamas is the government of Gaza, and it is declaring that there should be more war at the end of this process. As far as Israel is concerned, that is a non-starter. Israel greatly values its alliance with the United States and wants to work in coordination with the Trump administration for building a better future for the people of the Middle East that does not see Hamas in power in Gaza or Hezbollah fully armed in Lebanon. We are done with the days that existed before October 7th, where Israel was surrounded by terrorist armies and Israel waited to be attacked. Those days are over, and I hope we can plan for a better future that involves peace instead of war.
Daniel Rubenstein, former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. North Korea's Kim Jong-un is calling for a strong and modern army that is ready to cope with any war. The comments came during his visit to a military academy. South Korea's intelligence agency says Kim's inspections of military units and training might be in preparation to send more soldiers to Russia. A massive power outage has hit Chile, plunging the country into darkness. The blackout was caused by a transmission line failure in the country's north, according to the Interior Minister Caroline Toja. The country is under emergency and curfew orders, and armed forces have been deployed to maintain order. The power outage also cut electricity to major copper mines, buffeting global metal markets. And finally, foodies in China are flocking to a funeral home to try noodles, which have gone viral on social media. Diners are waiting in lines for over an hour to order the dish that's been served at Erlong Funeral Home's canteen. Some are even posing as mourners to try and get it. It's prompted the home to announce that it will allow some members of the public to eat at its premises, as long as they don't disturb genuine mourners. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is now on his way to Washington to meet President Donald Trump, where he'll join his Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who arrived there earlier this week. Ahead of his trip, he announced the biggest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, with the budget rising to 2.5%. He also said the additional funding will come from slashing the UK's overseas aid budget.
And it is right, and I think the whole...
For more on this, I'm now joined by our correspondent who's in London for us, Olly Barratt. Olly, this announcement has raised concerns that the British Prime Minister is pandering to Donald Trump before his visit, hasn't it?
It has. That is an accusation, Leigh Ann, that's being rejected by the UK government. The John Healey, the Defence Secretary, earlier today saying he wouldn't accept that characterisation. But Keir Starmer himself on Tuesday, when talking about the rise in defence spending, said that he thought that the last few weeks had, in his words, accelerated his thinking in terms of how and when the UK needed to up its defence spending as a proportion of GDP. So Keir Starmer seemed to be acknowledging that, yes, events related to Donald Trump's positioning on the Ukraine issue, but also around calls for European nations to uplift their defence spending. Keir Starmer appearing to acknowledge that that was at least part of his thinking. Now, the government did come into power saying that it wanted to get to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence at some point, but it hadn't yet put a timeline on it. And what we saw from Keir Starmer on Tuesday was him really setting out that timeline in an earlier time frame than had previously been expected. And clearly, he wanted to get those numbers out there and get that schedule out there before heading to Washington on this trip.
Yes, indeed. But as we know, he's on his way to Washington right now. But earlier today, he was in PMQs. What reaction did his plans get there? We know PMQs can be so rowdy sometimes.
It can be. And Prime Minister's questions saw Kemi Badenoch for the opposition Conservatives broadly saying that she was in support of the government's decision and timeline, but it also allowed her to try and pick through some of the numbers, because Keir Starmer had been saying when he made this announcement that this would mean by 2027 that the UK would be spending £13.4 billion, $16 or $17 billion a year more on defence. The government has since acknowledged that that is only really the number if you don't account for inflation over that period. We're really looking at more like $7 or $8 million extra per year. So that was the line of attack from Kemi Badenoch, and that will also be interesting to see when Keir Starmer's in Washington. The big number is likely to potentially impress Donald Trump rather more than the smaller number. So it'll be interesting to see whether Donald Trump is as positive about the uplift in defence spending as the UK government hopes he will be.
Yes, I bet Keir Starmer's crossing his fingers. As we said, on his way to meet Trump, but all eyes will be on their meeting. Today, he's repeated his calls for Ukraine to be at the table for peace negotiations. We've heard him say this before. Starmer appears to be going to Washington really at a crucial time. What will he be trying to achieve with his talks?
Well, he will be trying to make some of those arguments directly to Donald Trump. That idea that he believes that Ukraine should be at any kind of peace talks that are taking place around the Ukraine conflict. Also, a key argument for Keir Starmer to make to the president, which is potentially a tricky one, is this idea that Keir Starmer believes that in any kind of peace deal for Ukraine with Russia, you must have, according to Keir Starmer, what he keeps calling a United States backstop. He seems to want some kind of security guarantee in there from the Americans to make sure that it is, in his words, a sustainable peace over the long term. The difficulty, of course, is that just in the last few moments, Donald Trump has been suggesting in Washington that he's not a big fan of committing the US to any kind of security guarantees in Ukraine. So there are clearly a number of areas around Ukraine-Russia policy where Keir Starmer and Donald Trump up to now have had rather different positions. So Keir Starmer faces an uphill task potentially in trying to bring Donald Trump round to some of those kinds of views that are held in European capitals.
Olly, we've said that there's some sticking points between both of them, but do you think the defence spending is enough to get Trump on his side and see he's serious about changing the UK's ways?
It was certainly welcomed very quickly by the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth. He said that it was a strong step from the United Kingdom. So I think the UK government is optimistic that Donald Trump will be in a positive frame of mind off the back of this announcement. But the UK government and Downing Street will also be well aware that there are huge potential pitfalls on this visit. You never quite know what Donald Trump is going to say about any particular topic in public or indeed in private. And Keir Starmer will be hoping to get away from Washington towards the end of the week without some kind of huge public falling out with Donald Trump, derailing the rest of the visit. So in a sense, he wants to get away unscathed. To set the bar high, he would want to also try and bring Donald Trump around to some of the views that are held in European capitals about the best way to approach peace negotiations. But it is clear that Downing Street made this announcement on defence spending ahead of this visit, partly because it felt that Donald Trump would be receptive to some of Keir Starmer's arguments, having made that announcement.
Olly Barratt in London. Donald Trump's Unpredictability is keeping us very busy at the moment. Thank you for being across all of that. Let's take a look at the top business news now. BP has announced it will cut its renewable energy investments and focus on increasing oil and gas production. The energy giant revealed the shift in strategy on Wednesday following pressure from some investors unhappy its profits and share price have been lower than its rivals. The move comes as Shell and Equinor have also scaled back plans to invest in green energy, and US President Donald Trump's drill baby drill comments have encouraged investment in fossil fuels. Now, shares in Tesla have slumped more than 9% after EU and UK sales fell by almost half in January. The company's valuation is back below $1 trillion for the first time since November 2024, as shares do slump. Tesla owner Elon Musk has been making controversial political waves on both sides of the Atlantic. In addition, it is facing very stiff competition from Chinese and other electric vehicle manufacturers. Let's turn to sports news now. Australian radio host Marty Shergold has been taken off air after making so-called misogynistic and disrespectful comments he made about the country's women's football team. He said on nationwide radio station Triple M that the Matildas players reminded him of Year 10 girls, and that implied their matches were boring. He apologised earlier on Wednesday and was due to be back on air, but did not appear in his usual time slot. And Inter Miami's Lionel Messi has been fined an unknown amount for grabbing the New York City coach by the neck. Video footage shows Messi approach the coach and grab the back of his neck, causing him to pull away after the 2-2 draw in Miami. Now, a reminder of our top stories. President Volodyrmr Zelenskyy confirms Ukraine is preparing to sign a minerals deal with the United States President. Trump says he expects the deal to be signed this week. Meanwhile, Trump reveals his vision for Gaza in an AI video featuring him sunbathing on the beach with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is accused of pandering to Trump as he boosts the UK's defence budget but slashes foreign aid ahead of their meeting at the White House tomorrow. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next is Riz Khan. He interviews Gad Saad, an evolutionary behavioural scientist and author of The Parasitic Mind. And don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with G&T. Good night.